Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're here to listen to Kola's work on Black Orpheus. Kola is a Nigerian writer, linguist, and independent academic researcher with over a decade of fieldwork in African studies, literature, technology, and what he's working on right now. He's the author of Edwardsville by Heart, which was published in 2018, Igba Ewe, which is translated poems, and Esu at the Library, as well as other poems, which he published in 2024. He's the Africa co-editor of Best Literary Translations Anthology, published by Deep Vellum, now in its third year. He has been a Chevening Research Fellow at the British Library from 2019 to 2020, and he has also translated the works of Chimamanda Adichie, Haruki Murakami, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, James Baldwin, Sarah Ladipo Manyika, Cervantes, and others between English and Yoruba. His work is in language advocacy, earned him the Premio Ostanza Special Prize in Cuneo, Italy in 2016, and his recent work in film has earned him 3 awards for Ibrahimi Road, a Museum of Memory. So I would like you to help me welcome Kola, but before that, I would like to thank the Kansas African Studies Center for their support and helping sponsor this program. The African American Studies Center as well, which is the AAAS. Thank you for your support, and the Institute of Digital Research and Humanities, the IDRH, for their support as well in helping organize this event. A few announcements before we start. We will have the public talk by Lauren Klein tomorrow at 4 at Watson Library, which is going to be about data feminism. So if you can make it, that will be great. And for now, please join me in welcoming Kola to talk about Black Orpheus. Thank you, Kola, for being here.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I appreciate you coming. I have a small presentation. I think they said I have 40 minutes, so I'm going to try to run through them as much as I can. Let me share my screen now. I hope this works. Technology hasn't been my friend lately. Okay. Share. Can everyone see my page? Can you see the presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. My name is Túbọ Sún. I am the publisher of Olongo Africa. I am a writer, like you said, and I thank you for this wonderful opportunity to speak about something I've been working on for the last almost 12 months now. I mean, way longer than that, but I will give you the background during this presentation. Okay, is the slide moving, by the way? I just want to be sure. Has it moved to the next one? I want to be sure I'm showing the right slide.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so my name is Kola. You know, they've introduced me already. Let me give you a little background about Black Orpheus for those who might perhaps not know anything about it. It was first published in a journal. It's a literary magazine. Show you a copy. It looks like this. If you can see me, you will see. My blurry background is messing things up. I'm gonna see if I can disable that so you can. Okay, it looks like that. Can everyone see this? I don't know what you're looking at, so I'm never sure. So Black Orpheus was published, a literary journal, literary magazine, published first in Ibadan in 1957. It was founded by 2 German gentlemen, scholars. One of them was Ulli Beier, the most famous one. And the other one was Jan Heinz Jan, who is also a German literary scholar. The journal was first funded by the by the Ministry of Education in Ibadan, Western Nigeria. 1957, of course, for those who don't know, was 3 years before Nigeria got its independence. So this was, Nigeria already had some limited self-governance, but it hadn't gotten full independence from the British. So that was the environment where the journal was founded. And at this time, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart had not been published. So think about the very, very, very beginnings of modern Nigerian literature. Yan and Beier had met a year earlier in a conference in Paris, sponsored by Présence Africaine. And in there, they had discussed the possibility of publishing. I think they were inspired by the conversation that happened there. French West Africa had already got Senghor, the famous poet who became president, and there were a number of important writings happening then, especially the Negritude movement. And so they thought they needed to have one space to have conversations about African literature. So then the journal was published in 57. Achebe's novel was published a year after. And then the editorial board of the journal expanded from the two gentlemen to eventually Africans in there. So in 1960, they added Ezekiel Valele and Wole Soyinka. And in 63, Soyinka left. And then there were a few other people, O.R. Darton and Abiola Irele, who joined much later. Are you still seeing the slide? Is it moving? Somebody please confirm, just be sure.
Yes,
Okay.
good color.
Thank you. All right.
It is.
So the journal published a number of important writings in English by African writers. But like I said, the beginnings were, it was inspired, actually in Ulli Beier's words, the idea was to expose African writers in English to writings that were already happening in French West Africa. So at the beginning, it was, let's find all these writings in other languages, let's translate them into English, let's make them available to other writers. But eventually, when African writers started writing, like I said, Things Fall Apart was published a year later. There were a number of new writings coming out. It became a journal to expose what was happening in English West Africa to other parts of the world, other parts of West Africa, and eventually other parts of the world. So it featured a number of important writers. In many of the names we know today, Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Gabriel Okara, Christopher Okigbo, J.P. Clark, Samuel Selvon, Paul Thoreau, whom I was surprised to find in there, Leopold Senghor, and a number of others. So you would see these are people who wrote in English, in French, from the Caribbean, from the Americas, Dennis Brutus from South Africa, among others. Ulli Beier eventually also started what they call the Mbari Club. I'm going to speak a little bit about that, which was a club and an organization of writers founded by Achebe and Okigbo and Soyinka with him, which eventually became the home of the journal. But the idea was also to continue the conversations they were doing in arts and literature. Okay. Between 57 and 67, 22 editions were published of Black Orpheus. They sometimes publish 3 every year. I think in some years they published 2, and maybe in 1 year they published 1, but mostly it was about 3 every year. And so it lasted for 10 years. So you can see how intense that period was of literary publication. Within a few short years, 22 editions were published. There were 6 editors, like I mentioned. About 216 writers were published. There was poetry, there was reviews, critical essays, drama, features of Nigerian artists doing important work, and a number of things like that. Many of these covers, like I highlighted here, were designed by Ulli Beier's then wife, Susan Wenger, and later Georgina Beier. But there were a few Nigerian artists were also credited as having contributed, like Jacob Afolabi and Muraino Ilami. And in one instance, somebody called Patient T, who was a patient in one of Ulli Beier's early workshops in Oshogbo and in Ibadan. He and Susan Wenger had a couple of art workshops in some psychiatric hospitals. I think it was an experiment. And one of the patients there drew this amazing artwork that eventually became one of the covers. So part of what I'm doing, I'll get back to it, is to showcase many of these Nigerian writers and artists specifically that were on the covers of the journal. So this is an overview of at least the first 10 years of the journal. In 1967, like many of you know, the war started, Nigerian Civil War started, which marked the end of the first volume of Black Orpheus, but I'll get back to that. One of my favorite published works in Black Orpheus was this poem by Wole Soyinka, at least three poems actually, called The Immigrant. First one was The Immigrant, second one, The Other Immigrant, and the last one, My Next Door Neighbor. I find this particular set of poems fascinating because they haven't been published anywhere else. Soyinka has been widely anthologized, published in several places, but these poems have not been published anywhere else. They were first published in 1959, and this was around the time he was first arriving in Nigeria back after his work at Leeds. It's fascinating because when you read it, you would find the theme similar to the theme behind his famous poem, Telephone Conversation, which critics would probably agree were written around the same time and around the same theme. It's about the immigrants. It's about this poet persona who is meeting British people for the first time and is trying to decide how to interact with their racism. Quite funny, quite irreverent, and the three of them, quite beautifully, describing that experience. But Soyinka never published it anywhere else, and I've asked him why, and he said, like many of the poems he wrote in those times, he probably lost track of them, etc. And when we showed him the magazine, he was quite surprised to be able to see them again. So this is fascinating, a discovery for me. One of the other things I found interesting there was this review of Things Fall Apart, published in 1959, I believe, a year after the novel was published, which is also interesting in a way that it helps us look at how the novel was received when it was first published, before they knew that it would become a global bestseller. The Civil War happened, like I said, in 1967, and Ulli Beier left Nigeria. He had lived in Nigeria all through, and like I said, he was instrumental to the creation of a number of artistic workshops and the founding of Mbari Club. And he also published a number of important writers across the continent, including Dennis Brutus, in books and pamphlets. But in 1967, perhaps due to the war, he didn't say that specifically, but he got a job in Papua New Guinea, so he had to leave Nigeria. There have been other reports about conflicts between him and a number of other Nigerian writers who thought that the foreigner was taking too much space, and that they weren't sure he was accountable in the way he was managing the fund, etc. A number of stories that I'll get back to much later. He left Nigeria in 1967. He went to Papua New Guinea with his wife, Georgina Beier, his second wife. And after a year later, during the war, 1968. Sorry about the noise. There's a lawnmower outside. I hope it's not disturbing. J.P. Clark took on the mantle of the journal. J.P. Clark was a famous Nigerian writer, J.P. Clark Bekederemo, who was also an important poet of those times. He and Abiola Irele, another writer, took on the magazine in 1968 and tried to sustain the energy of the original Black Orpheus, but they could not sustain it for so long. This red edition in front of you is the one that was published in 1968, the first one after the first volume had ended and Ulli has left. And what you notice, of course, is that the artwork in front of it is quite different, most different from the other ones, because this was done by Nigerian artists. I think Bruce Onombrakpeya or Demas Nwoko, I can't remember any now. And this is meant to immortalize Christopher Okigbo, the Nigerian poet who had died a year earlier in the Nigerian Civil War. And then a few other editions came. So back and forth over many years, there were many other editions published, not as energetically as they were in the first edition, maybe once every year. Sometimes they published, sometimes they did not. And then sometimes they would just stop publishing for a while. So there was a volume 2, which is the one Clark and Irele edited. There was a volume 3, which I think only J.P. Clark edited when Abiola Irele left. And then there was a volume 4, which had a number of issues in the 1970s. And then there was a volume 5. And then finally, volume 6. This volume 6 is the one on the right here. This is number 2 of volume 6, published in 1993, which was the last time we found any copy of the journal, probably the last one ever published. This was by the time edited by Theo Vincent, a Nigerian scholar who is now late. The covers, of course, had become different. They had changed the tagline of the journal from Black Orpheus Journal of African and Afro-American Literature, which was what Ulli Beier called it, to Black Orpheus Journal of African Writing. And of course, the arts on the covers were done mostly by Nigerians. The subject matter stopped being just Pan-African or connecting to diaspora, but just from African writing. So in 2024, through Olongo Africa, we secured a grant to revisit the legacy of the Black Orpheus project. And we started with this exhibition at ArtX in Lagos, where we secured some copies of the journal, made them available. For some people, it was the first time they were actually seeing copies of the journal at all, anywhere in Nigeria, which is strange for a journal that was published first in Ibadan, Nigeria. And this lasted for a couple of days. And it was the beginning of the exploration that we aimed to do throughout the year. But I'll come back to this in a minute. I just want to tell you how I got to this this juncture, how I even got myself into taking on Black Orpheus and what Black Orpheus had meant to me over the years. So I grew up in Ibadan, Nigeria, and like I said, Ibadan was at the time a city, a center of much culture and literature development. In 1957, it was of the venue where Black Orpheus Journal could be published, supported by government funds. But when I was growing up in the 80s, there were so many of these books in my house. My father bought many of them. Atoka is a magazine, a journal, a picture magazine. There were many of these books. There was these Black Orpheus publications. And I took them for granted because they were all around the house. Sometimes I read them. Sometimes I was just fascinated by the covers. And then I left Ibadan. I went to university, of course, in Ibadan. And then I left after many years. Many of those books, of course, got destroyed. There was a storm that destroyed the house. Some took them away to school, didn't bring them back. Anyway, we didn't treat them as if they were something important. It was much later. But these are some of the other books that I was growing up with. It was much later when I was in the university that I started hearing about Black Orpheus as an important cultural resource. I think they referred to them in literature classes. We heard about how Shoyinka was publishing them, but we never quite saw any copies. I don't remember ever coming across any copy while I was in the University of Ibadan, which was, again, the center of many of these publications. It was 2019 when I became a research fellow at the British Library that I heard about this exhibition that was about to happen called Into the Night, Cabarets and Clubs in Modern Art. And here, the exhibition focused on clubs and spaces and arts organizations that helped artists defy the times or like confront politics or provide a space for refuge for many people doing creative work. And Barry Club became one of those centers that was explored in the exhibition. This was happened at the Barbican in London, and all of the building was turned into like different clubs, different recreation of those important spaces. So one of those spaces was the Mbari Club. They had the design, they had everything to look like the old Mbari Club in Ibadan, or Mbari Bayo in Shobo. And there was also an exhibition of some of the publications that they did. And it was then that I finally saw all these books again in one place. This is a picture from the Barbican in 2019. And I realized seeing them that the memories just kept flooding back that, oh yes, I do remember seeing many of these things around the house when I was growing up, and I didn't take them seriously. And this was there being exhibited for the first time. And I hadn't seen them in Nigeria anywhere I had been. So it got me thinking about the importance of archives and how we preserve things. And I started asking just questions about, how did, well, the British Library had bought them, of course, just individual copies over the years. But how come Nigeria didn't have them? And I realized how expensive they were. Of course, I started trying to look online to buy them. I think I bought my first copy around $30 or thereabout at the time. And I still thought it was very expensive, and it was hard to find all of the, editions at once. I knew there were many of them had been published, but not all of them could be found in one piece. So during those times, when I traveled to Nigeria, I would go to the National Library trying to find whether there was anybody who knew where I could find copies of Black Orpheus, which was published in Nigeria, and Nigeria had this legal deposit laws that was supposed to keep anything published in Nigeria in a record where people can have access to it. I went to the National Library, I went to the Kennedy K Library, I went to personal libraries, public libraries, and nobody seems to have any idea. So that bothered me for a while. This was during my fellowship year. I just come to Nigeria for a visit. And I realized, I think at the time brought to me the danger, the problem actually that existed in Nigeria for so long that I hadn't been aware of, which is that many of our historical archival materials had not been well preserved or well taken care of or well kept in a way that people could access them or people could refer to them or people could use them in an important educational way. So I was very depressed. I wrote this long essay about it, which you can find on my blog over there. Um, and I found out how much, National Library of Nigeria was getting in national funding, and just wondered why, with the legal deposit law, we couldn't even have a way to preserve magazines that were published in Nigeria. And you could find them in London. I could Google WorldCat. I could find these journals in almost every Western library, but nowhere anywhere in Nigeria. So that became an obsession. So I started buying copies of the journal, which ones I could find. It became more expensive. I think it became around $100 and so on. Even then, in 2019, 2020, this was during the pandemic years. And I started buying a number of other books as well. Any rare book I could find, first editions. The more I looked, the more I realized that there were so many materials that were important and instrumental to early Nigerian literature, Nigerian history, uh, important, archival documents, books and journals and publications that I couldn't find anywhere else. So I started buying them. And just for myself, I became a collector. I wrote a bit about this as well. And then 2022 happened. I was in the US and I heard about this exhibition again about to happen about Black Orpheus Journal. This time I was at the Chrysler Museum in Virginia. And it became really, really big. So many people were talking about it. And I think for the first time, I realized that people in the West, especially, started paying attention to what Black Orpheus Journal meant. And I think at the time when I tried to find any copy to buy, it had become like $1,000 to buy even one copy. This particular exhibition was the catalyst for that. I think many people. I didn't go to the exhibition. I couldn't visit. I went online. I saw many of the presentations that were happening, and I realized that it had opened many people's eyes to Black Orpheus. But the exhibition was also focused on Jacob Lawrence, who was a Black American artist who visited Nigeria in '62. So it wasn't about Black Orpheus itself, but they did explore Black Orpheus and what it meant for African literature while focusing on Jacob Lawrence. So this, I think, became the biggest catalyst for me that, okay, many people have been exploring this journal, which meant a lot to the beginning of African literature. And in Nigeria, where the journal was published, nobody has any idea where it is. They have some apocryphal idea about what the journal used to mean, but don't have copies of it. University of Ibadan didn't have or didn't, show me that they had any copies left in good condition. And I was determined to, number one, collect all the editions I could find and make them, scan them, read them for myself, because I wanted to myself also find out what was inside it, and then scan them and make them available to other people through Longo Africa so they could do so. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this also was that I had been a participant in African literature conversations for over 10 or 15 years. And some of the things I kept finding was conversations um, that seemed devoid of the knowledge of what had gone past. You would find people arguing about particular things as if this was the first time this conversation was happening. People making wide declarations that had no reference to things that have happened that have connected to this in a way that could illustrate the present even more. So I believed then that, many of the things that have happened in the past, many of the things that were happening currently, and the way we're having the conversations showed that the absence of um, important materials connecting them to, old conversations and old events and activities needed to needed to happen. And there had to be a connection between the 60s and the current time. And that over the years, the 70s and 80s, when the economy got bad and military took over, there had been a black box, so to speak, that kind of cut us off from the ancient traditions or the early traditions of African writing and the modern time. So I thought that making this available would give people some idea of how people, practiced literature in the past and what kind of conversations they had. And hopefully it informs what we do in the present. So, of course, now if you look for Black Orpheus, you find that this was as of yesterday. Somebody listed 15 issues of the journal for 13,750, which is a lot of money. And so we decided finally to seek funds to do the exhibition, to digitize the magazine and make them available. So thankfully, Open Society Foundations gave us the funds. We found all the copies. It took a while, took a lot of legwork. There are a number of collectors who exists privately. There were sometimes occasional auctions online from different sources, some in better conditions than others. We finally managed to get all the 22 original editions and then all the volume 2 and then some of the volume 3 and so on and so on, and we continue to collect them. But this exhibition helped showcase the ones we had at the time. And much later, earlier in the year, we got all of them. But the idea I had at the time through Olongo Africa was to first collect, again, digitize all of the materials so that people can have access to it. And then set up a fellowship, select 10 people who want to interrogate the journal. Because again, this started from my own interest in engaging with the magazine myself. But I thought, well, in 1 year, if it's just me, there will be so many directions I may have blind spots on. So how about inviting other people to come and do some work? So we invited 10 people. People applied, and then we selected 10. We gave them some funds, made the digital copies available, and asked them to do interesting things with it. And the aim was to make sure that each person would look at it from different angles and tell us what they have found. And then by making the journal available, we then open to everyone in the world who may want to have access to the journal but do not have access to it already. Yeah, that's that. And so we found these 10 people: Yadichima, Tinashe, Sarah, Ebun, Ife, Kosoluchi, and each of them, there were 59 applicants, and then we selected 10 of them. Each of them wanted to do different aspects. Somebody wanted to reinterpret the covers in her own style. Somebody wanted to use the metadata, a number of different things. These are the 10 of them. And when we finally digitized the journal, thanks to our collaboration with a Nigerian NGO called Archiving, we put all the volumes online. So it's volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, like I said. Volume 4, at the time, we hadn't found any copies yet. And even at the time, I had no idea how many were published under volume 4. And then we found volume 5 and then volume 6. And then I created the metadata, which I had been working on for many years before then, through the small copies I found in different places. And the metadata looks something like this, which is a list of every article published in Black Orpheus, the name of the author of those articles, the page where you can find it, and what type of work it is. This, I thought at the time, was something I would have wanted to have access to when I was hearing about Black Orpheus, but didn't know what was inside. I didn't know who was published in it. I didn't know what kind of work they did. And I thought creating something like this would help people who want to research instead of, we have 29 copies, for instance, scanned and put online. It's hard for a random person to just come and jump into it and know where they want to go. But if you go to the spreadsheet, you can search for the name of an artist, writer, whoever you're looking for. Search for Shoyinka, it brings Shoyinka, shows you how many works he published in what day, and then you know what PDF to go for to look for it. So that was what metadata was. So we have done that. We put that online. And then when we finished, we took all those journals, physical editions. Like I said, they've been rare now, very expensive to find. And my thought process at the time was, what do we do with these journals after we've done the scan? You can't just put them in a public library because of aforementioned issues. You don't want someone to just go there and pick them up and throw them away or not take care of them, and then you find it back online, somebody trying to sell them. So we made them, all of them, donated, well, we had a 2-year loan agreement with a private library in Lagos called Guest Artists Foundation, which is a non-profit public library and art space created by Yinka Shonibare, the Nigerian British artist. And the idea was that they would keep those journals. And they also have a couple of other donations, I think by the Picton Archives is also there. They would make them available on demand by scholars or researchers, anyone who wanted to have access to it. Those people would book appointment and go there. And while they're having access to the journal, they'll be supervised so that nobody can damage them and nobody can take them away. So this is a 2-year renewable loan that we hope would continue into many years. Again, this idea is that the books are physically available for people to have. It's not locked up behind the wall somewhere. And it's also, you don't have to travel to the UK or to the US to be able to have access to physical magazines that were published in Nigeria and are very important to the early Nigerian literature. Okay, these are just a few other things we've done throughout the year. This is a picture of me in Germany in July at the Humboldt University, where I randomly discovered that there was a workshop happening related to the work of Jan Heinz Jan, who was the co-founder of Black Orpheus, and whose role in the journal has not been well documented or celebrated as Ulli Beier. We'll probably have some time to talk about him a little bit. And I found it quite interesting workshop. I learned so much. I was able to also to see many of his collections, his letters between him and many of the early Nigerian writers. And letters are now hosted at the Humboldt University. But throughout the year, we've also attended a number of events, like the University of Kansas Digital Humanites Forum in Ghana. Thank you for inviting us. Many of our fellows were there. Lagos Studies Association Conference, African Literature Association Conference in Nairobi, where I did a little presentation. And then I used the opportunity of my visit to Germany to visit the Jan Heinz Jan Library in Mainz, which also has a number of collections of his. And there, actually, that was where I found these two of these journals, this number 5, volume 5, number 2. I hadn't seen it anywhere else. You know, I remember I said it took a while to find even the original volume 1. This particular volume 5, I hadn't seen anywhere. I didn't even know it existed. I was happy to see it there at the library. And then this volume 2, number 7, which again, volume 2, I thought were just 2 or 3 editions published, but I was surprised that they had up to 7. So there are still many more copies out there that either are in private libraries that nobody knows, or in public libraries in Western spaces, or are locked up in some wardrobe somewhere that nobody knows. But the fact that there still exist copies that one can't find and one can't reference became something that has bothered me. So we hope to still continue to find as many as possible, scan them, and then make the physical copies available as well. And you can see the covers are also different and quite interesting. That one in the corner here, the hardbound edition, were a result of a collaboration between the Black Orpheus project and the Kraus reprints publishing. Sometime in the early 70s, they decided they were republishing many of the classic African books. So I think somebody got together and convinced them to reprint Black Orpheus Journal, which had even at the time become rare because they hadn't published so many copies because of lack of funding. So they did some hardbound editions, putting all the magazines together in a hard copy edition. This is the second place I've seen this bound edition. I happen to have one of them as well. So part of the things we did at the fellowship, I mentioned earlier that somebody was trying to reinterpret the covers. This is one of them. This artist, Yadi Chima, who was one of our fellows, is trying to redo, if Black Orpheus were to be brought back today, what would the covers look like? Using Nigerian artists as a template for the cover design. That's why we asked her to reinterpret the covers in our own way, and this is one of the reinterpretations she did. She's hoping to do 10 original covers, so-called covers, as part of a fellowship. Other people are doing other interesting things. I found her work very interesting, and she's an Igbo artist, so this is one of the interpretations that's happening. And one of the things we hope to do at the end of the fellowship, which is rounding off this year, is to then work on a book. And the book will have one, the result of the fellowship, which is all the writings that have been done, all the arts that have been created, all the photos from all the engagements we've done, the places we've visited, and then a couple of other essays, new essays, interrogating different other aspects of the Black Orpheus generation and Black Orpheus project. One of the things that interested me a lot is that Black Orpheus has, like I said, played a very important role in the beginning of African literature, but the reinterpretations, the engagements, the public exhibitions that have happened recently have only focused on different minor aspects of it. The one in the UK, which I visited, was looking at Mbari Club as a club and a space and a refuge for artists, which is nice. The Chrysler Museum one is focused on Jacob Lawrence, which is an African-American artist, again, which is nice. But Black Orpheus as an African archive is something that hasn't been well explored. And I think for a journal that played such an important role at the beginning of African literature, in the 50s, we haven't claimed it as an African archive, and we haven't created enough work to celebrate that important aspect. So that's what this book that we hope to publish next year or thereabout will focus on. So all the work that the fellows have done, new important writings, and then photographs and a number of other explorations that showcase what makes Black Orpheus important as an African archive. We're working with the Walewa Books, which is in Germany, hopefully Masobe Books in Lagos, and we're also looking for a university press, at least in the US, so that the book can have wide circulation. I'm also hoping that the metadata we created for the journal, we expand it as well to not just Black Orpheus, but a number of important early Nigerian writing and literature or African literature that has been published at the time. There's Transition Magazine, there is Okeame, there is Okike. There's so many journals that published at the time which helped give space for African writing. I'm thinking of an idea of a website, a permanent space where people can research, can search and find links to important writings and know where to find them. WorldCat, for instance, gives you that location access. Like you want to look for a journal or a book or a movie or whatever in a Western library, you can Google and know where it is. Something like that, but for all the early Nigerian writings and African writings that were published, so one can search and find them and be able to locate them. Either also so we can have scanned editions of those publications where we can find them so that other people can have access to them, or also be able to purchase and have them physically available in public libraries. It's just crazy that many people writing today and working today don't have access to many of these publications and have to sometimes travel or find somebody in Western universities to get it sent to them. I also thought about at the beginning of this project, when I was still very ambitious and feeling invincible, that wouldn't it be nice to bring Black Orpheus back as a journal of contemporary African writing? I'm still exploring that, and I don't know where that is going to go. I've not closed the door yet. Many people say, well, why are you doing that for? It's a journal that's had its time and is gone. But so was Transition Magazine, and now its permanent home is at the Harvard University Hutchinson Center, where it has institutional funding and it continues to publish, maybe once a year or once a quarter or thereabout. And Black Orpheus was an important catalyst for African writing, or at least a space, an institution, and it deserves that kind of revival as well. So who knows what's going to happen? But that's, again, some of the things I've been thinking about. Like I said, the two big exhibitions, Into the Night, they did publish this book, also a very hardcover, physically, remarkable book in photos and essays and stuff. The other one as well. And then there was this one by Peter Benson, which talked about the Black Orpheus and Transition Magazine and gave an overview of the work they did. So these are the only three major books I think that have explored this journal. Like I said, each of them looked at different angles. We haven't had one that celebrated as an African archive, and that's what I hope to bring with the book we're hoping to publish. And some of the ideas I have, again, like I said, some of them have already been written, some have been published already at Longo Africa, but there's several other ones I still have in mind. Some of them I'm still working on, some of them I've pitched to many writers. For instance, the fonts of Black Orpheus, many people who have seen the magazine know that the way the fonts were designed were quite interesting, and many of them designed by Susan Wenger. And for a while, I actually thought there was just a standard font that was just used throughout the journal, but no, almost every edition had a separate individual design for the font. So I'm exploring how maybe one can bring that into the internet space. This is looking at my own work as a linguist and language technology person, creating a space where one can use that font to then do a number of interesting new things today. So I have somebody looking at that. I thought about the relationship between Georgina and Susan Wenger, who were married to Ulli Beier at some point in time together, as two European women who came to live in Nigeria as Yoruba women in a polygamous home, and the relationship when they lived in that house in Ibokun Road. Somebody is looking at that. The metadata, the women who were published in Black Orpheus, somebody has written a very important essay examining how many women were published there, where they are now, what their work meant, etc. So there are many other different dimensions that I'm hoping that we can explore. And all of this will be in the book we hope to publish. The photo here is of a conversation between Abiola Irele and Jan Heinz Jan, one of the records kept at Humboldt University. And I'm thankful to Professor Susan Geman for giving me access to that when I was there. I have mentioned this already. There are many other important books like Odu, which was also published by Western Nigerian Ministry of Education, by Ulli Beier earlier before Black Orpheus. Many of them, you can't find them anywhere else again. Okike Magazine. There are many of those important publications that I believe we still have the capability to digitize and to also acquire and make available in some fashion to African writers and readers. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I can answer your questions if you have any. And that illustration, that mural there was painted by Susan Wenger somewhere in Ibadan, but I think so it's been painted over as well. And nobody knows where it is now, which is, again, speaks to part of this conversation about memory and archives and presentation. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Wow, thank you so much, Kola. This is so amazing. I have learned a lot. I mean, I think before this talk, I just knew a little bit about Black Orpheus, but I think this talk has given me so much information that I didn't know before. And I guess it's the same for our audience because when I was looking at the chat, I saw comments about how wonderful the work is with the cover art and all of that. So that's great. We will open this session up to the audience for questions, but before we do that, we just want we just want a few answers from you for questions that we had beforehand. And so, Kola, if you can help us answer that, that will be amazing. So I think the first question is about the colonial logics of appropriation and power. So when we think about Black Orpheus, we think about Ulli Beier. So I think we just want to know for a fact that given the history of colonial logics of appropriation and power, how does it come up in relation to the founder, Ulli Beier?
Yeah, one of the things I discovered during the investigation was that Soyinka actually didn't want to join the editorial board. He rejected that name, Black Orpheus. I think he said he found it a little preposterous. Of course, it wasn't Bayer's idea, the name. Jan actually had a year earlier published an anthology of African writing called Schwarzer Orpheus, which means the same thing in German. And years before then, Orphée Noir was a title, it's again in French, of an essay by Jean-Paul Sartre, written for Lepard Senghor's book. So the idea of a Black Orpheus, Orpheus is a Greek, figure. The idea of a Black person occupying that, Orpheus spirits to explore and do all of that was something that was attractive to Europeans at the time, I believe, and they, I would, to be generous, are thinking of it as a complement of, to the person they're referring to as, somebody who embodies the spirit of adventure, both European and African. And so that is already, a conversation of its own in the first place. But it has a history, like I said, it didn't just originate from Ulli Beier. So there have been conversations about, the role Ulli played in Nigeria, and even when he was there, and Susan Wenger there are conversations that continue to happen even today as to what's appropriation, were they exploiting or were they contributing? Again, there are people on different sides of it. But what you can't deny is that the presence at the time had an important role in helping document and stimulate the conversations that were happening at the time about African literature. So that's what I want to explore. And of course, there are many things I found as well in the omissions. For instance, like I said, the covers, most people would associate the covers with Susan Wenger. Some at some point, maybe to Georgina Bayer, who did some of the last 4 or so covers. But there were like 3 or so Nigerians who did, who participated and whose names are not always often referred. And so part of my work is to explore and revisit many of the omissions that exist in the narrative around Black Orpheus. Like I said, everybody's taking the parts they like and exhibiting it. Well, we were there when this was happening. It was happening in my city where I grew up. And so what can we find that defines Black Orpheus as an African archive, as an important space for African conversations? And so while the big conversations about decolonization and appropriation is happening, so is a conversation about the role Africans played in, helping this journal move forward, and how it also helped in, stimulating the conversations around African literature.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. I want us to address a question in the Q&A from Jude. Jude is asking, what resources are available for getting information on John's role in the production of Black Orpheus?
Yes, Jan was someone I only knew by name, when I started, but the 3 days I spent in Berlin actually helped, give him a more three-dimensional figure. He was very interesting, fascinating man. It was very intense. He never lived in Nigeria, like I said, which probably helped, Ulli get rid of him when he wanted to. But he was very instrumental. Many of the early conversations that happened between Aimé Césaire, many of the French West African writers in early Black Orpheus editions, especially the first 3 or 4 editions, were through his connection. And he also translated many of those work. So there are a lot of resources at the University of Berlin, Humboldt University. You should probably check that out. And I think a number of other books have been written about him and his role. We also hope that in the book we are hoping to publish, that someone from the Berlin University and the Bobby project that I visited would be able to write about Jan's role, and also look at many of the conversations he's had, the correspondences, and give us some idea of many of the things we don't know yet. We don't always remember when we're talking about early Black Orpheus, but which were attributed to his own important contributions.
Thank you so much. We see your hand up. Amma Bema, if you want to go ahead with your question, and then I'll read Coley Gray's question after you, Amma.
Yes, thank you. This was such a wonderful presentation. I learned quite a bit. I have 2 questions and maybe just a comment, and I'll make them quick. One of them is a technical question. So you shared that you were digitizing these materials, and I'm wondering if you had to go through any sort of process to gain permissions, if your goal is to maybe put those digitizations on the web, what that process looks like, if there are any sort of roadblocks or hurdles or things you've had to go through in order to do that. And I'm wondering that specifically because I imagine that a number of the writers are deceased at this point. How do you get permissions for individual pieces? Do you get permissions for the journal as a whole? That's part one. The second question is, I'm wondering, as you looked at the various issues of the magazine, if you noticed a difference in the material that was in them when the name of the magazine changed, right? So I'm wondering if there's a difference when we have a journal of African and Afro-American literature to just a journal of African literature, if the material that appears is different. And then this one's just a comment. One of the things I heard you say towards the latter end of your presentation is that you're hoping to collect this sort of metadata on other magazines. You mentioned Ocheme, you mentioned Transition. I just wanted to share that my team has worked on collecting the metadata for Transition, and I'm happy to share that with you, and I'm happy to email that over to you if it would be helpful.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I'm hoping hopefully that we eventually have a centralized space where all of these materials, people who are working in different spaces can be able to collaborate, so that we don't just keep working in silos. So thank you very much. The question about changing in the materials over the years. What I noticed, of course, there were more Nigerian writing after Ulli left. When J.P. Clark, who was a little militant about his role, like the covers were the most visual difference you could notice, that they were using more Nigerians on the covers. And then the content, of course, much later, when Theo Vincent was editing, and what I noticed in many of the much later editions, whether the content became more scholarly. There were a lot of references and footnotes. They were not always like that in the early days. In the early days, they were kind of vibrant, people doing different things in different ways, easy things you could read while waiting at the dentist, very catchy, deep, of course, essays, but sometimes very breezy and easy to get through. I think the later ones had more heavy, dense essays, essays in there. Probably because many of those editors, Theo Vincent was an academic in a university, Ulli Beier was not. And so many of you could probably trace many of those kind of differences. The most important question you asked about the rights and what obstacle we went through is also something I wrestled with for a while, for a long time. First, I wanted to know who had the rights to Black Orpheus, who owns the right to the name in any case. If even one wants to resuscitate it, who do you ask? And that led me to a number of, to a number of was warrants and corners, because the answers were not straightforward. In 67, when Beier left, J.P. Clark had taken him to court for a number of reasons and wrestled the organization Barry Club away from him. But J.P. Clark also eventually then left. And because the journal was first sponsored by the Western Nigerian Education Department, you could say that Western Nigerian government owns the right to the name or to the publication, but there's no more Western Nigerian governments either. And then when J.P. Clark stopped working, then Theo Vincent, and then Longman's published it for a while, and then it went to Daily Times. So it was gone around so much that institutionally it's hard to know one person that is in charge. I even asked Felicia Inka about it. He himself, doesn't claim to know, and he's the oldest surviving editor of the journal. He himself doesn't lay claim to even being the one in charge of it, right? So what I resolved eventually was to digitize all of them, make them available, but don't make them downloadable. That's the only window I left, closed, to say that I'm not doing this for profits. And as you can see, we just want to make sure people can use it for, fair use, have access to be able to use it. Because I know with most people, they see things, oh, they download it, they keep it, and they probably never even use it. But if you have the metadata, you know what you're looking for, you can go there, you can find it. If you need me to send you a page or whatever, I can scan that and send it to you. But we're hoping that that protects us from, the worry that this is being exploited in a way. And it, again, is not we're not making money from it. It's not an economic project. So I hope that answers your question. But that's where I am with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kola. Thank you, Alma, for your question. Kola, I'm going to move to Koli's question. He says, I have been researching in the U.S. National Archives the Cold War independence period in Africa, and there's some materials there relating to Black Orpheus and Mbari and their writers and artists. Is your project also interested in exploring how these initiatives were seen externally during the period?
Yes, many people have explored that. That Peter Benson book, for instance, spoke to many of the early conversations, especially the interaction with the Fairfield Foundation, I think which was connected eventually to the CIA, which provided money for some of the early publication cultural organizations in Nigeria, in Africa at the time, including Transition Magazine. And I think Abiola Rele's leaving the journal in 68 had something to do with him, the news coming out at the time that CIA had been part of providing the funding to this foundation that they got money from, and they wanted to distance themselves from it. So there is an ongoing conversation also about whether the funding they got, influenced their thinking or in some way. And many of the editors have come out and said that they didn't even know that it was connected to CIA, and many of them pulled out when they found out. So yes, I'm very interested in every of those conversations, how those journals, played their role in the politics and the both literary and governmental politics of the time. And yeah, the idea of the book is to open the door to many of the things that haven't already been talked about in the public space. But mostly creating a space for conversations to continue to happen, especially from an African perspective, like I said. Many of the Western perspectives have already been covered, but if there is any other new one, of course, we are willing to look at it. And we are still open to, writers or scholars or editors or people who have any other different perspective to be able to participate. The nature and the design of the book we haven't figured out yet. We're still working with the publishers. So when the time comes, we will make that available for those who want to contribute. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Dr. Oluwafemi, I will get back to you in a second. We have a question from Matilda. Matilda says, is there a desire or plan to explore audiovisual storytelling on Black Orpheus in the future? She's referring to a memory lane voyage referencing important geographical landmarks.
Yeah, Matilda wants me to do another film. Yes, I I remember when I was applying for the grant, thinking there were so many ideas I had I wanted to do, and I remember one of them was, okay, I'm going to do a small documentary on Black Orpheus, and I have been doing some, small video coverage and spreading magazine around, shooting them in different angles, and interviewing a number of people. Actually, I remember I went to Hailing Island, somewhere south of England, to meet Gusty, I can't remember her name, who knew Susan Wenger as well, and I interviewed her on tape. Anyway, I'm gathering information. There are parts of it that could benefit, eventually from visual storytelling, but there's so much work and so little time. So maybe, who knows, something might come up, but I don't want to commit anything before you hold me to it. So if anything comes out, you'll see. Thank you, though.
Thank you. Dr. Alabi, you can please go ahead with your question.
Yes, let me sincerely acknowledge the effort of the researcher for your research effort to ensure that there is a revitalization of Black Orpheus journal. As in the course of your presentation, I tried as much as possible to search for the journal online and discovered that I discovered your effort so far. I saw the metadata as you mentioned, and I was able to go through the various volumes and editions of the journal. There was a question that was raised by, I think, Amma, particularly on the accessibility to the journal online. I try as you mentioned that the journal will be accessible, the journals will be accessible online, but not downloadable. You especially mentioned that people who need access to this journal can contact you, and then you can make it available to them. I want to ask if that won't constitute some kind of labor on you. Won't it be a kind of burden on you to be responding to as many people may need this journal? And why is it not preferable that you make them available for download? Since you said that it is not for profit purpose, is it not better that you make them available online for people to download and make use of at any time they need the journal? That is one. I want to quickly mention, you mentioned your efforts, your further research effort on Odoo. I can tell you that that will be a rewarding effort, and I can categorically inform you that the Faculty of Art of Obafemi Awolowo University has actually resuscitated the journal, and there is ongoing call for paper for submission for the journal right now. So that is just a piece of information to pass across. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, what I was trying to say was that the journals are available online, like you said, you can have access to, you can look at it. But I've had one or two requests of people saying this particular one page, can I have a better, what's it called, a better, high resolution, whatever, copy of it, and it's just like one page. We're not sending the journal itself, to people. That is physically available in Lagos. If you want access to it, you can reach out to the library and you can have access to it. But thank you for the comments.
And we have about 15 to 20 minutes more. So if anybody has additional questions, I think now is the time. Otherwise, I have a few questions of my own.
Oh, I'd also wanted to thank Ashley, who spoke about Almeida. Almeida is also doing something really interesting, which is trying to aggregate metadata of African literature production as well. And they are using artificial intelligence, and it's really interesting stuff. She left a link in the comments if you want to check it out.
Okay. I also wanted to draw everyone's attention to the chat box because as we were talking about, having access to rights and all that stuff, I think Brian Rosenblum put a very important comment on there, and he says, regarding rights, when we've digitized and put online journals from time period here at KU and had these same questions about rights, we've included a note to the effect of, if you are the author or rights holder and want this taken down, let us know. And they've never had a takedown request as far as he knows, right? So he has a link to that. So if anybody wants to check it out, please feel free to do that. And I think Ashley also said something in there. Ashley Harris says, we're hoping that the African Literary Metadata Project will enable such a shared space of metadata sharing. And so she also has a website on there that people can visit. So everyone, please feel free to do that. And then going back to our questions, Kola, and I think you may have already answered this, but is your revisit of Black Orpheus a decolonial intervention that goes beyond just putting scans of magazine online?
Is it the colonial intervention? I am not appointing myself as a prophet of anything. I am curious about the journal. I care about it. I've enjoyed reading them. I still haven't finished reading all of them, and I do want to. I'm interested in early Nigerian and African literature and the productions that exist. I'm interested in connecting it to the present. I'm interested in making that available to other people who want to do that. If it helps in decolonization, fine. But even what we're doing today, we're still using many colonial tools. The internet is still a colonial tool. If the internet is taken off today and we don't have access to them anymore, how many more things can we access, and share? So yeah, I'm just doing my best, putting whatever the skill I have to the use of the things I care about. If that works for decolonization, perfect.
And I think this is from James. He also talks about the question of access, which you have, addressed to some level of extent. But he's saying that for a Nigerian-based magazine, did you find copies in Nigeria? If not, what does that say about the state of the archive in Nigeria and the fact that cultural memory is preserved outside of Nigeria? And he says that I know that KU Libraries has copies of the Onisha Market literary pamphlets that may not be available in Nigeria, to give us an example.
Yeah, the fact that many of these journals don't exist in Nigeria was something that depressed me to no end when I tried to find them in 2019 when I was going around the National Library, especially because it was published in Ibadan, the same city, and the University of Ibadan didn't have access to it. The person I spoke with, who had worked in the library for a while, said it's possible that they have it. It's possible that it's in somewhere, and the person who knows where it is might not be around, or it might be locked up in somewhere. It might be in a badly preserved space. Most of the things the library was focused on were textbooks that students could use. But Nigeria did have this legal deposit law that said every item published in the country copies have to be left in the National Library. So I went to the National Library, they didn't have it either. They didn't even know what the Black Orpheus was. Like, what are you talking about? What is this journal? I had to be showing them photographs of it. So it is quite depressing, and there's several journals and things produced that have suffered that same fate. And many of these institutions abroad that have them didn't have two heads, like we say in Nigeria. They just bought a copy and kept them safe, which seems simple enough. So, and they still continue to buy them, by the way, until today. And we do have funding. We have Nigeria is poor, Nigeria is rich. We have oil money. The question is, what is the priority? What are we doing? How are we preserving what is ours? So I'm done trying and worrying and crying about what they're not doing. I just want to do what I can and hope that it connects with what others are doing and it makes a difference.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think before we leave, there's one more question that I saw. Okay, from Ife Olua. Ife is saying, hi Kola, you've spoken already about the need to figure out ways to work within the gap left by the absence of proper public infrastructures in Nigeria. I wonder if you can speak even more broadly about the long-term goals and desires with respect to archives and infrastructures in Nigeria and how to continue to fill that gap.
Yes, so the pilot the pilot idea of having a renewable loan with private libraries in Lagos was something I thought about when I visited GAS in 2021, I believe. And I thought that worked out because they're a space run by a private nonprofit, and it's accessible to people, and you could go there and use the magazine, and they are sure to protect it and make sure it remains, in there. People can't take them away. People can't mess them up. And so I thought about, scaling that around the country, for instance. So if we have funds to acquire even more important materials of this nature, find another library somewhere, maybe another one in Ibadan, maybe one in Sokoto, Abuja, whatever else, so that over time, without me having to worry about building a library somewhere in Nigeria, a public space for people, I can work with existing structures that exist. So again, maybe eventually we'll be able to work with public libraries as well. But again, I don't have huge confidence, but who knows, that could be possible. But the idea that if you have any materials, instead of keeping them all, I could have said after the grants, after we're finished digitizing, I'm bringing the Black Orpheus back and locking it up in my house. Nobody's going to beat me up for it. But I think the aim is to make sure people have access to it. And if we can scale that idea in different ways, it transforms the way we think about public access. So it's still not a public library, but it's not locked up behind the glass, inaccessible to people either. So I hope we can, do more things like that. And if there are other ideas of how we can do it, hopefully we follow up on it. And thank you, Professor Raji, that there are copies in UI. Yeah, I think I heard finally from Charles when I was in Germany that there were still some copies in UI. I don't know whether they have everything. He said they have, quite a few. Some of them I have, some of them I don't. But it's interesting that they found some of them eventually. But we should have all of it, but we don't. There's still some from that volume 4, for instance, that I haven't found anywhere else. Yeah.
Great. I guess we're going to have our final question before we leave, and that says, based on your experience on this project, how can digital projects avoid reinscribing the violence of coloniality and the biases of the institutional archive?
Yeah, I think we've spoken about it already. The idea that to have access to something, you have to go to London, get a library card, fly there once a year to be able to have access to it, is something I found quite dispiriting. We have Kenedike, which is a big, important library in Ibadan. We have Ezekiah Library in Ife. All these places should have almost exactly the same thing that you can find in London or in Berlin, but that's not the case. So, we can't keep replicating the same ideas that have denied us access to important materials, especially materials that we created ourselves, in our own spaces. So whatever we can do to change that narrative, I think is very important. And I want to be a part of it in any way possible.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Kola, for this insightful talk. Everyone seems to have learned so much. I see so many positive comments in the chat. And everyone else, I hope that you look at the chat because there are some websites on there that you could visit to help you as you also do your own research. But before we all leave, I